Everyone thinks they know who Anne of Cleves was. The ugly wife. The mistake. The foreign princess Henry VIII took one look at, recoiled from, and discarded as fast as he legally could. In the popular version, she's a punchline. Henry VIII marries her for politics, calls her a Flanders Mare, finds her so unattractive he can't consummate the marriage, and then neatly annuls it. Anne walks away with a few castles and a new title, the king's beloved sister, and the story ends there. A failed queen, an awkward marriage, a woman remembered for her face more than her life. But what if I told you that this version of Anne of Cleves is not only shallow, it's almost completely upside down? What if the woman dismissed as a royal embarrassment left behind one of the most astonishing documents of compassion in Tudor history? What if the so-called ugly wife turned out to be the most quietly generous, strategic, and protective of all Henry's queens, not while she wore a crown, but in the way she prepared for her own death? Because hidden in plain sight is a piece of paper that changes everything we think we know about her, her last will and testament. A will in which Anne of Cleves did something almost unthinkable for a woman of her rank. She used her fortune not to flatter nobles, not to secure more favor from the crown, but to protect her servants, support the poor, and even safeguard children's education for years after she was gone. Today on Hidden Crowns, we're going to reveal the secret will of Anne of Cleves, the rejected wife, who, in the end, may have understood love, loyalty, and power better than Henry ever did. We're going to walk through the life she lived, the choices she made, and the words she left behind on that final document, line by line, decision by decision. Why did she leave most of her household 4 years' wages? Why did she use Henry VIII's name to shield them, even after she was already dead? And what does this say about the woman history wrote off as a failed queen? By the end of this story, you may never again see Anne of Cleves as the joke of Henry's love life, but as the one who walked away from him and still managed to protect everyone who served her. Before we begin, remember to like this video and subscribe to Hidden Crowns, because some of history's kindest hearts are buried under the ugliest reputations. To understand the meaning of Anne's will, we have to go back to the moment she stepped into Henry's world and into his trap. Anne of Cleves was born in 1515, a German princess from the Duchy of Cleves on the Lower Rhine. She wasn't raised to dazzle courts with clever wordplay and music like Anne Boleyn. She wasn't trained in flirtation, French fashion, and dangerous charm. No one coached her in how to turn a conversation into seduction. Anne's upbringing was practical, almost plain. She learned to manage a household, to sew, to supervise servants, to keep accounts, to understand food, rents, and supplies, to survive in a political world where men made decisions and women suffered the consequences. In another life, she might have married a local prince, run a modest court, raised children, and faded quietly into history. But in the late 1530s, a storm called Henry VIII was still looking for another wife. By then, Henry was running out of queens. Catherine of Aragon, dead. Anne Boleyn, executed. Jane Seymour, dead in childbirth. 3 wives gone in less than a decade. England had a fragile male heir, a shaken court, and a king whose reputation was beginning to terrify Europe. Cromwell, his chief minister, needed allies in Protestant Europe, and the Duke of Cleves offered a useful connection against Catholic powers. So they sent for a portrait. Hans Holbein, the king's favorite painter, traveled to Cleves to paint Anne. He painted her in rich clothes, calm, composed, her face symmetrical and solid, her eyes watchful rather than seductive. Not a siren, not a flirt, a woman of stillness and composure. To Cromwell, she was perfect. She looked modest, respectable, and politically safe. To Henry, on paper at least, she seemed acceptable. And then reality arrived. When Anne came to England in the winter of 1539, Henry couldn't resist his favorite theatrical trick. He disguised himself and barged into her chamber, expecting a swooning, romantic reaction straight out of a chivalric romance, the kind of fantasy scene he loved to cast himself in. Instead, Anne, who had never been raised on English courtly games, who didn't recognize him in his silly costume, barely reacted. She treated him like any stranger, with the polite confusion of a woman surrounded by foreign faces and languages, trying to avoid offending anyone in a country where a wrong look could be fatal. Henry was humiliated. In his own mind, this wasn't just an awkward moment. It was a blow to his pride. And Henry, when humiliated, always rewrote the story to make himself the victim. From that moment on, it became politically convenient for him to say that Anne of Cleves was ugly, repulsive, not what he'd been promised. Was she really? No reliable description calls her monstrous. Most say she was middling, pleasant, reserved. Not dazzling, but not hideous. But Henry needed an excuse. Not just for himself, but for Europe, for his court, for his bruised ego. A king who had split from Rome, discarded a Spanish princess, and executed Anne Boleyn could not admit that he simply did not feel young or powerful anymore. So Anne became the Flanders Mare, and that's the label history stuck on her. They married anyway on January 6, 1540. Henry sulked through the wedding. He told physicians he could not consummate the marriage. He complained about her body, her smell, her clothes, anything to avoid the simple truth that he was older, sicker, and less virile than he wanted to admit. In the bedroom, he reportedly kissed her, touched her lightly, and then declared he felt no great desire. Modern historians argue over what that means, but the one thing it certainly wasn't was Anne's fault. Within 6 months, the marriage was annulled. The official reasons were technical, a pre-contract Anne might have had with another man, and Henry's supposed inability to perform. The real reason? He wanted out. And this time he didn't want another execution. This is where Anne did something that changed her life and possibly saved it. She did not resist. She did not make a Blackfriars speech like Catherine of Aragon, throwing herself at the king's feet.
I am the king.
She did not fight, like Anne Boleyn, until her enemies invented charges of adultery and treason. Anne of Cleves looked at the pattern of Henry's wives and made a deadly accurate calculation. Argue with this man, and you die. So she agreed to the annulment. She accepted a new title, the king's beloved sister, and with it a vast settlement of lands, houses, and income. Richmond Palace, Hever Castle, estates and manors dotted across the country, regular incomes, servants, status, comfort without the constant threat of Henry's bed or Henry's timber. The woman Henry rejected as a wife became one of the wealthiest women in England. But there was a cost. That settlement was her freedom and her prison, because with it came 17 long years of something few people truly talk about, solitude. Anne of Cleves never remarried, not once. Not despite being young. She was only about 25 when her marriage was annulled. Not despite being rich. Henry didn't forbid her from marrying. On paper, she was free. In reality, who would dare? What nobleman in England would risk marrying the king's beloved sister, knowing Henry's jealousy and unpredictability? What foreign prince would want a cast-off English queen whose value as a diplomatic pawn had already been spent? So Anne lived in a strange in-between space. Not queen, not wife, not a mother. Officially honored, socially useful, emotionally sidelined. She sometimes returned to court, appearing at feasts, present when Mary and Elizabeth took their turns in history. She rode in processions, sat in the galleries, watched Henry's later wives take the seats that had once been hers. She would smile, bow, play her part in the royal dance, and then retreat again to the quieter world that was now truly hers. Her houses, Richmond, Hever, Chelsea, Chelsea Old Manor, and other estates. And there, away from the noise of court, she built something that no royal spectacle ever shows you, a household. Not just a building full of servants, but a community. Maids, stewards, cooks, grooms, chaplains, tutors, scribes. People who depended on her income, her choices, her personality for their survival. They saw her on ordinary mornings and tired evenings. They watched how she reacted when money was short, when repairs were needed, when someone fell ill. For 17 years, this rejected queen oversaw everything. She managed finances. She ordered repairs to leaking roofs and crumbling walls. She hired and dismissed servants. She made sure food reached the table and salaries reached the hands that earned them. And all of this in a country where she remained the outsider, the woman who had nearly been queen, but never quite. In that quiet world, her real character revealed itself, not through drama, but through decisions. How she treated the people who worked for her, how she handled money, how she reacted to fear and change without the protection of a husband or children. Those decisions were written down in one place, more clearly than anywhere else, her will. When Anne of Cleves lay dying in 1557, she was about 41 years old. She had outlived Henry VIII and every wife he had ever taken. The Flanders Mare turned out to be the wife who survived his reign. As her health declined, Anne did something that only a handful of people in Tudor England had the power to do in such detail. She wrote a last will and testament that carefully distributed her wealth exactly the way she wanted. Most noble wills follow a predictable pattern. Money and lands go to powerful relatives, strategic friends, church foundations, maybe a handful of token gifts to long-serving servants, a year's wages, a gown, some plate. They read like one last performance of rank. One final time, let me show you how important I was. Anne of Cleves broke that pattern. When historians examined her will, they found something astonishing. She left the majority of her personal wealth not to great lords, not to ambitious cousins, but to the people who had served her, many of them for years, even decades. Most of her household staff were left with 4 years' worth of wages. 4 years, not 4 weeks, not 4 months, 4 full years. In a world where losing one's position could mean immediate descent into poverty, this was not just generous, it was radical. 4 years of wages meant time. Time to find new positions, time to survive between employers, time to marry, to start small businesses, to care for their own families. Time to breathe, instead of falling straight off a financial cliff the moment their mistress died. Anne's will reads less like the document of a discarded queen, and more like the careful last act of a woman who understood exactly what insecurity felt like and refused to pass it on to the people who had trusted her. And she didn't stop at servants. Anne left money for the poor in the parishes where she had lived, not as a vague gesture, but as specific instructions for alms and relief. She named places. She named sums. She made sure that the villages and neighborhoods that had watched her carriages pass would feel something more than dust in her wake. She left funds to support education for children because she knew, perhaps better than anyone, that ignorance is its own prison, and that the next generation could be lifted by something as simple as a book, a tutor, a chance. In an age when education was still a privilege, not a right, this choice speaks volumes. And then came perhaps the most quietly brilliant detail of all. Anne of Cleves knew that once she was dead, her servants would lose the protection of her name. They were hers in a world where hers would soon mean nothing. So she reached for the one name that would still terrify anyone who tried to cheat them. Henry VIII. In her will, she specified in some bequests that certain protections, lands, or pensions were to be respected in the name of the late king and under the authority of the crown. Anne, the wife Henry rejected, used his lingering power like a shield, even in her final act. She could no longer protect her people personally, so she attached them, on paper, to the ghost of the man who had once discarded her. That is not the move of a stupid, pitiable woman. That is the move of someone who understood exactly how power works in the long run and how to bend it toward kindness. So, who was Anne of Cleves really? Was she the awkward, ugly foreigner Henry claimed he couldn't bear to touch? Or was she the woman who walked away from a dangerous marriage with her head intact, her fortune secure, and her humanity unbroken? Look at her pattern. When faced with Henry's humiliation, she did not explode. She endured. When offered an annulment that could have ruined her, she negotiated, accepting a settlement that gave her independence in a world where queens usually left court in a coffin. When living as a wealthy, unmarried woman in England, she did not become bitter or reckless. She ran her estates, kept her dignity, and built bonds of loyalty with those who served her. She could have spent her money chasing favor at court, collecting jewels, buying influence. Instead, she built a financial safety net for people whose names will never appear in history books. And when she died, she did not cling to wealth for the sake of posthumous glory. She handed it down, not up. The real story of Anne of Cleves is not about whether she was pretty enough for a vain old king. It is about what she did once he decided she wasn't. For 17 years, she lived without husband, crown, or children, the three things Tudor women were told gave their lives meaning. Yet somehow, she managed to leave behind a legacy more humane than any of Henry's monuments to himself. So, what does Anne's will really tell us? It tells us that she understood something Henry VIII never did, that power is temporary. People are not. Henry spent his life tearing down monasteries, building palaces, commissioning portraits, and marrying wives like they were costumes. Anne spent her last years making sure that when she died, the people who had depended on her would not be left completely exposed. He chased immortality in stone and paint. She chased it with people. 4 years' wages to servants may not sound like much next to a royal tomb, but which matters more, really? A slab of marble carved with a king's titles, or the full cupboards and warm fires of dozens of households who survived because their mistress thought about them when she was dying? Anne's will is not just a legal document. It is a quietly explosive statement. I knew what it was like to be in someone else's power. I will not let that happen to you when I am gone. She had no children of her own, so she treated her household like her family. She had no crown when she died, so she used the last crown she knew, Henry's memory, to strengthen the protections she could write into law. That is not a weakness. That is a strategy wrapped in mercy. And yet, for all this, Anne of Cleves remains one of the least understood women in Tudor history. We have no diaries from her, no heartfelt letters, no confessions of what she really thought of Henry, of England, of the wife who replaced her, of the queens who followed and fell. We only have fragments, an annulment document, a few ambassadorial reports, some household accounts, and her will. So we're left to imagine, did she ever look back and regret not fighting harder to keep the title of queen? Or did she sit in her warm house, safe, fed, surrounded by people who owed her their livelihoods, and think, I survived the monster? That is enough? Did she watch Catherine Howard, barely more than a girl, raised up and then dragged to the block, and whisper a prayer of gratitude that she had chosen life instead of pride? Did she walk through her halls, looking at the servants who bowed to her, and think, when I am gone, You will not be abandoned the way I was. We will never know, but her will speaks in the place of those missing words. It tells us that if you want to know who someone really is, don't listen to the insults thrown at them by a humiliated king. Follow the money. Follow the care. Follow the choices they make when they have nothing left to gain. Anne of Cleves chose to lift others as her final act. The ugly queen, the rejected wife, left behind something that makes all of Henry's grandeur look small. Proof that it is possible to live in the shadow of cruelty and still die kind. Who do you think understood power better in the end? Henry VIII, who used it to break people? Or Anne of Cleves, who used what little she had left to protect them? If you were offered the choice between a crown that might cost you your head and a quiet life that allowed you to save others, which would you take? And what do you think Henry would have said if he could have read Anne's will and seen that while he was busy rewriting England, she was rewriting what mercy looks like from a discarded throne? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. Whose legacy moves you more now? The king who married 6 times, or the wife who was not pretty enough, but kind enough to remember everyone else in her last breath? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Hidden Crowns. Because this is only one of many hidden stories behind the glitter of royal crowns, and next time we'll open another forgotten document, pull on another loose thread in Tudor history, and see what unravels. This is Hidden Crowns, where history's quietest voices finally speak.